Hello, everyone. It looks like some people are still joining us, but we are going to get started here right at 6. We are so glad you are joining us today for a special event organized with the support and invitation of the University Club, Alumni Club of San Diego. The University of Chicago Divinity School also wants to offer an additional welcome to our Divinity School Advisory Council members joining us as special guests of the Alumni Club of San Diego and the school. For our program this evening, we welcome Dr. Russell Johnson, Assistant Director of the Undergraduate Religious Studies Program and Core Sequence at the Divinity School, for a presentation today on villains in popular film. A graduate of the Divinity School, Dr. Johnson has served the school since 2019 as a teaching fellow, Assistant Director of the Undergraduate Religious Studies Program, and has offered the most enrolled course in the undergraduate program's history, Star Wars and Religion. He recently published a book with Cambridge University Press titled Beyond Civility in Social Conflict: Dialogue, Critique, and Religious Ethics. Dr. Johnson's lecture today is based on an undergraduate religious studies course and will provide insight into how popular movies shape viewers' moral judgments and intuitions, including how we imagine our enemies, envision justice, and think moral or immoral thoughts. Just as a quick housekeeping note, Dr. Johnson will be concluding the lecture with a time of questions and answers. During the lecture, please feel free to use the Q&A tab on your Zoom window to ask any questions that come to mind. I'll be returning to help field the questions when the Q&A period begins, so feel free to ask them throughout the lecture. And I'll pass along as many as I can to Dr. Johnson. Dr. Johnson may also invite you to share reflections or thoughts as we go along, which I will pass along as appropriate during the Q&A period. Thank you for joining us today, Dr. Johnson. We look forward to your lecture.
Thank you. Thank you, Madison. Thank you all for being here and joining me this evening. My name is Russell, and as Madison mentioned, I teach in and help direct the Undergraduate Religious Studies program here at the University of Chicago. One of the courses I teach is titled Villains: Evil in Philosophy, Religion, and Film. In this course, we watch popular movies and put them into conversation with theories of moral wrongdoing from different religious and philosophical traditions. Screenwriter John Rogers writes, quote, "You don't really understand an antagonist until you understand why he's a protagonist in his version of the world," end quote. This principle holds true of movie villains, but it also raises important questions about disagreement, dehumanization, and the diabolical in the real world. In this class, we address questions like, are our enemies truly malicious or just misunderstood? How does a person become a monster, and how does a person avoid it? Why are some villains so compelling, and what does that say about the good life? Do Hollywood movies enrich or distort how we imagine and respond to real-world evil? Did Thanos do anything wrong? As you might imagine, it's quite a popular course, and it helps students get introduced to Buddhist, Christian, Hindu, Jewish, and other various philosophical ethics. And as you can imagine, it's also a very fun class to teach, although it's one that can vacillate in somewhat jarring ways. It's not unusual for me to be talking about the bombing of Dresden one moment, and then the next moment talking about the minions from Despicable Me. I trust you'll bear with me. This evening, I'm going to talk about moral frameworks and how we use ideas from the arts and from stories we've heard to make sense of our own lives and vice versa. As I'm speaking, feel free to reflect on the movies that have made an impact on how you see the world and live within it. And you can put those in the chat. And as Madison mentioned, we might have time to refer to those at the end. A lot of times when people talk about movies shaping our morality, they have and normalization. The direct emulation theory, if we want to even call it a theory, was very prominent in the immediate aftermath of the Columbine high school shooting of 1999. The killers wore dark trench coats and shot people in a way that reminded many of the film The Matrix, which had been released a month before the attack. The suggestion was that these two young men saw Keanu Reeves and Carrie-Anne Moss walk through a hallway and shoot a bunch of people looking cool, and were thus inspired to emulate them. The strong version of the direct emulation argument, that violent movies make people do violent things and so on, is easily disproved. After all, The Matrix made $465 million in the box office. Millions of people saw it, and the overwhelming majority of them did not go on to kill people. Violence in media is one factor among many others in real-world violence, but demonstrably not the most important factor. Likewise, psychologists have studied the so-called Werther effect, in which there is a slight but statistically significant increase in people ending their own lives in the aftermath of a publicized suicide. It's referred to as the Werther effect because the title character in Goethe's 1774 The Sorrows of Young Werther ends his own life. And after that book came out, there were a range of similar incidents in the real world. Young men in Werther's situation ending their own lives using the same method. More recently, one study showed that after Netflix's 13 Reasons Why was released in 2017, there was a 26% increase in Google searches for how to commit suicide. It's not that watching these media made people do something, but it became easier for people to imagine doing an action because they identified with a fictional character who did it. Thus, while the strong version is obviously false, a weaker version, that we see people on screens and want to emulate them, is certainly true. You only need to look at fashion to see that. When the 2007 movie Atonement came out, Keira Knightley wore an emerald green dress that immediately became iconic, and people rushed to buy it, some replicas going for thousands of dollars. They didn't want to look good in a green dress. They wanted to look like her in that green dress. Even today, there are Etsy sites that make the atonement and actions we choose to imitate. This understandably works in the moral realm as well. Watching Atticus Finch defend an innocent man in To Kill a Mockingbird doesn't cause you to do a good deed, like a law of gravity causes you to go down. But you may find yourself consciously or unconsciously returning to his example, asking what he would do in your situation and emulating his actions. As feminist theorist Barbara Deming puts it, we catch courage from one another, and this includes catching courage from fictional characters. In addition to direct emulation, there's normalization. The obvious example is how public opinion about sexuality has changed in many parts of the United States over the last 30 years, and the undeniable influence that representing openly gay people on TV shows like Ellen, Will and Grace, and the original Queer Eye in the late 90s and early 2000s had on that cultural shift. Scholars talk about this in terms of intergroup contact. Spending time with people, even fictional people, living normal lives and struggling with relatable problems, tends to break down stereotypes we have about these people groups. You think about people differently when they're in your living room from 7 o'clock to 7:30 every Thursday on ABC, and this informs our moral judgments. Normalization also includes what psychologists call the bandwagon effect. That is the subconscious, if everybody's doing it, I'm more likely to do it tendency. It's not quite direct emulation, but if we see people like us doing an activity, we're more likely to consider doing that activity. It feels less strange and more familiar. Normalization is, of course, used for marketing purposes. If I see Vin Diesel in Fast and Furious drinking Coronas, since his character and I obviously have a lot in common, I'm going to be more likely to pick up a case of Corona, because now I know that's a beer that people like me drink. Guys like me and Dominic Toretto, street racing tough guys who live our lives a quarter mile at a time. A third way that movies shape our morality is through information. We often, since the 18th century, distinguish between facts and values, between judgments of what is the case and judgments of what should be the case. This picture is oversimplified at best, but one thing it conceals is the role that facts and information play in our moral judgments. Take, for instance, the question of whether a person morally opposed to eating animals can eat marshmallows. To answer this question, you need to know whether or not it's factually true that marshmallows contain animal parts. The answer is, for most marshmallows, yes, they contain gelatin, which is made from boiling tendons and ligaments. Though, of course, you can get vegan marshmallows at your local vegan camping supply store. Our assessment of what is factually true shapes our moral judgments. So if a movie gives us new information, we revise our moral judgments in light of that information. Documentaries are an obvious example. An Inconvenient Truth explained some of Most of what I know about the Watergate scandal, for instance, comes from the 1974 film All the President's Men. Fortunately for me, that movie is for the most part historically accurate, except, of course, that the people in the movie are considerably more attractive than their real-life counterparts. But with a lot of films, it's not always clear what you're being given information about and how accurate it is, when you're being given information and when you're being given pure fiction or half-truth. Historical films rarely even aim for perfect accuracy. They're more often not based on a true story, or in 1974's Texas Chainsaw Massacre claimed to be based on a true story. But the events that it was based on, at least nominally, weren't in Texas, didn't involve a chainsaw, and weren't a massacre. That's a pretty trivial example, but how much of The Social Network is true? How much of Zero Dark 30? How much of Pocahontas? Perhaps it's better to say that movies shape our moral judgments through misinformation just as much as through information. A fourth way that movies and TV shape our moral judgments is conceptualization. That is, giving us new concepts or reinforcing concepts we already have. Conceptualization is what you think about when you think of something. What you think about when you think of something. For instance, I've never attended a wedding in India, and my primary exposure to weddings in India is through movies. So what comes to mind when I imagine an Indian wedding may conform to the general reality of Indian weddings, maybe, or it may conform to a very small percentage of Indian weddings, or it may be totally fictitious. After all, I don't trust Bollywood and Tollywood movies in their depiction of physics. Why should I trust their depictions of weddings? In a way, conceptualization is the flip side of the same coin as normalization. And the movies can foster stereotypes even inadvertently. There are lots of groups of people that you interact with primarily, if not exclusively, through media, and your perception of those groups is tinted or formed completely by these media. So media portrayal of these groups, even in fictional media, informs your assessment of what their lives are like, how they act and why, and how they should be treated. Think, for instance, of incarcerated people. For many people, when they think about people in prison or prison life, we're deriving our assumptions less from the facts of how things actually are, and more from the conceptual maps that we've been given from movies and TV shows. Another example is torture. In the real world, torture is remarkably ineffective. Research has shown that as a means for coming to reliable, actionable information, torture does not work very well at all. Also, the majority of people who are tortured for information either give misleading information or don't give information, usually because they don't have it. Torture is rarely used in ticking clock situations where it's the only option. More often, it's prolonged and not done with reference to any immediate threat at all. By contrast, though, in media like 24 and Taken and James Bond movies, torture is almost always used in high pressure situations, and it works almost all of torture. Their concept of what torture is and how effective it is comes primarily from fictional and fictionalized media, and yet they approve of or disapprove of real-world policies based on it. Conceptualization is especially tricky when it comes to villains and monsters. Take, for example, the classic 1975 film Jaws. The shark in Jaws acts more like a serial killer than an animal that's just trying to eat. The great white shark was portrayed as a malicious killing machine that sought out human victims. And not long after the film was released, there were a series of vendetta killings, white shark fishing tournaments, and lack of concern for preservation that almost wiped out the white shark population along the California coast. People to this day vastly overestimate the threat of shark attacks. In 2006, screenwriter Peter Benchley, who wrote Jaws, said, "I couldn't write Jaws today. The extensive new knowledge of sharks would make it impossible for me to create in good conscience a villain of the magnitude and malignity of the original." End quote. Director Steven Spielberg has made similar comments, saying, quote, "That's one of the things I still fear. Not to get eaten by a shark, but that sharks are somehow mad at me for the feeding frenzy of crazy sport fishermen that happened after 1975. Spielberg and Benchley certainly didn't set out to demonize great whites, but for many viewers, this film impressed on their minds what a great white shark is, thereby informing their subsequent real-world actions. Conceptualization also shapes our morality by introducing new categories into people's vocabulary. Take, for instance, the term blood diamonds. Blood diamonds are diamonds mined in a war zone and sold to finance the actions of a warlord or militia. This has been a problem for a long time, and people knew about it and tried to address it. But an important moment in the American understanding of this problem was the 2006 Leonardo DiCaprio and Djimon Hounsou movie, Blood Diamond. This movie gave millions of people a new concept to think with. Even people who didn't see this movie, and not a lot of people did, were soon talking about blood diamonds. Increasingly, people who are buying diamonds would inquire about the history of the diamonds they purchased because they didn't want to be buying blood diamonds. My favorite example of how conceptualization works is the origins of the pirate accent. We all know how pirates talk, yar, walk the plank, matey, yah, that sort of thing. But this is not actually based on actual pirate history. Of course, we don't really know what 18th century pirates sounded like. The pirate accent we know was more or less created by Robert Newton, the actor, in the 1950 film Treasure Island. And then it got imitated and repeated to the point that this is just how people came to think pirates talked. To recap thus far, we've talked about 4 ways movies shape our moral judgments: direct emulation, imagination. It is the morally relevant features of how one perceives the world, the narratives, categories, and images a person or community uses to make sense of the world around them and act within it. I'll repeat that. Moral imagination is the morally relevant features of how one perceives the world, the narratives, categories, and images a person or community uses to make sense of the world around them and to act within it. Humans reason by analogy. We make sense of events by drawing analogical connections with other events, including fictional ones. Even people eminently capable of separating fact from fiction have their expectations, associations, judgments, fears, and prejudices formed by entertainment media, perhaps as much or more so than by news media. And the direction of influence goes the other way too. What we are willing to accept as plausible or a good story in film is informed by our shared understanding of how people actually behave, what the world is actually like. To elaborate this idea, I'd like to talk for a while about an all-time great movie villain, in many ways a prototypical movie villain, the Wicked Witch of the West from the 1939 film The Wizard of Oz. The Wizard of Oz is one of the most watched and most beloved movies in film history. In 1998, when the American Film Institute listed it as the sixth best American film ever. And 5 years later, they listed The Wicked Witch of the West as the fourth best villain in the history of American cinema. She certainly earns her place. Somewhat like the origin of the pirate accent, Margaret Hamilton's portrayal of the ugly, shrill witch character became the defining image of witches in the American imagination. For example, the book The Complete Idiot's Guide to Wicca and Witchcraft has a section on what witches look like, which begins with, "When you hear the word witch, you probably think of the Wicked Witch of the West. But of course, even in The Wizard of Oz, witches all look different," and yada, yada, yada. Not only is her character prototypical of witches in the public mind, but also of evil in general. It's hard to overstate how many kids watch The Wizard of Oz and how scary and pitch perfect a performance this is. In fact, in 1975, actress Margaret Hamilton went on Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood and put on her Wicked Witch costume piece by piece, as she and Mr. Rogers reminded kids at home about how it's just a costume and she's actually a very kind woman. The maniacal laugh, the use of green and black and red, the menacing horde of minions, all of these became industry standard for villains in cartoons and kids' movies and other movies beyond that. So it's easy to forget that the Wicked Witch is not even the first villain we encounter in The Wizard of Oz. The movie opens with Dorothy in Kansas, running to her aunt and uncle, telling them about Miss Gulch. Miss Gulch hit Toto, Dorothy's Cairn Terrier, with the back of a rake. The first line of the movie is, "Aunt Em, just listen to what Miss Gulch did to Toto." Dorothy tries to get her aunt, uncle, and their three farmhands to listen to her concerns about her dog's well-being, but they're too preoccupied with their responsibilities to empathize. Dorothy longs to be somewhere else, somewhere over the rainbow, but is interrupted by the arrival of Miss Gulch herself. Miss Gulch is upset that Toto bit her and says, quote, "That dog's a menace to the community. I'm taking him to the sheriff to make sure he's destroyed." Dorothy tries to take responsibility and volunteers herself for punishment, but Miss Gulch has an order from the sheriff and she owns half the county. So Uncle Henry and Auntie Em have no choice but to surrender Toto. Dorothy, then dissatisfied with her life on the farm, flees with Toto, but after encountering a traveling professor, she realizes that her aunt really does care about her and must be worried sick about her, and decides to return home. You probably know what happens next. A tornado appears and Dorothy is whisked away to the magical land of Oz. The movie treats Dorothy's trip to Oz as a sort of dream. It begins when she bumps her head and ends when she wakes up in her bed. But we can also see it as analogous to Dorothy going to a movie. She's taken away from her humdrum Kansas life and for an hour and a half is in a bright, technicolor world filled with impossible things. The Wizard of Oz can quite fairly be interpreted as a movie about what it's like to watch a movie. The word film scholars use for the experience of getting wrapped up in a movie is being transported. You forget where you really are and for a brief while live in the world of the film, just as Dorothy lives for a brief while in Oz. It's a world like her world, but more vivid, more saturated, more exaggerated. The goals are more concrete and the threats are easier to identify. The way to go on is as evident as the yellow brick road. In this world, the contrast between good and bad is stark. The characters have clearer weaknesses and clearer desires, just like a movie. In Dorothy's case, the goal is to get home, and the threat is the Wicked Witch of the West. In this fantastical world, she meets a scarecrow who says he doesn't have a brain, but ultimately comes up with some clever plans, a tin man who says he doesn't have a heart, but ultimately shows great love, and a lion who says he's a coward, but ultimately acts courageously. Though at first they may not seem like much, when all the chips are down, all of them act honorably to help and care for one another. In the end, Dorothy throws water on the Wicked Witch of the West, melting her and freeing her soldiers from her control. Along the way, she learns a valuable lesson. The movie is very explicit about this. Near the end, Glinda the Good Witch tells Dorothy that she had to learn the truth for herself. The Tin Man asks Dorothy, "What have you learned?" Dorothy responds, "Well, I think that it wasn't enough just for me to see Uncle Henry and Auntie Em, and that if I ever go looking for my heart's desire again, I won't look any further than my own backyard. Because if it isn't there, I never really lost it to begin with." Then she repeats, "There's no place like home, there's no place like home, there's no place like home." The need Dorothy has at the beginning of the movie, wanting to get away from the farm and go somewhere over the rainbow, has been met, as she realizes that the real magic was the people who care about her, even if they don't always show the courage, heart, and brains that they truly have. Leaving the dream world of Technicolor and special effects and returning to the farm, Dorothy's moral imagination has been enriched by the time she spends in Oz. A minute ago, I said that moral imagination is the morally relevant features of how one perceives the world, the narratives, categories, and images a person or community uses to make sense of the world around them and to act within it. When we watch a movie, we are offered narratives, categories, and images. And then when we leave the theater, we use those to make sense of the world around us. This is very much the case in the movie within the movie that is The Wizard of Oz. The movie goes out of its way to show that the characters Dorothy meets in Oz are directly analogous to the characters she knows from Kansas. The three farmhands are played by the same three actors who play the Scarecrow, the Tin Man, and the Cowardly Lion, and the professor is played by the same actor who plays the wizard. When she wakes up, she says to each of them, "And you were there, and you were there." The implication is that while Dorothy is in Oz, she learned to appreciate the characters of her three companions, and thus when she returns, she will do the same thing. She'll find the courage in the cowardly farmhand Zeke, the intelligence in the brainless farmhand Hunk, and the love in the distracted farmhand Hickory. She'll use the characters and stories she's learned in Oz to interpret and act in her regular life in Kansas. This is a pretty clear depiction of how moral imagination gets shaped by stories. We are transported to somewhere unfamiliar, and when we return, consciously or unconsciously, we imagine our world through the lens of the fantastical world. It's all very heartwarming, but the film leaves one question completely unanswered. What's Dorothy going to do about Miss Gulch? There's still a powerful woman in her county who wants to and legally can destroy her dog. The movie could not make the connection between Miss Gulch and the Wicked Witch more obvious. They're played by the same actress, they have the same musical leitmotif, and Dorothy calls Miss Gulch a Wicked Witch. Both of them angrily hold someone accountable for an injury that was not their fault. Miss Gulch holds Toto responsible, and the witch holds Dorothy responsible. To cap it off, of course, during the tornado, there is this dissolve shot of Miss Gulch riding her bicycle into a witch riding a broom. So, as with the farmhands and as with the professor, the connection is clear. And presumably, just like with the farmhands and the professor, Dorothy is returning to Kansas with a lesson about how to think about Miss Gulch and what to do about her based on her encounter with the Wicked Witch. Is Dorothy going to kill Miss Gulch? How has this time in Oz shaped how Dorothy thinks about the villainous woman in her life? How should Dorothy think about the people who oppose her, given what she's seen in The Wicked Witch? What kind of narratives, categories, and images does Dorothy take from Oz to use in her real life? And what have we as viewers of this movie learned about wickedness? Even if the principal moral lesson of The Wizard of Oz is that there's no place like home, and what we're looking for is already within and right around us, we are still imbibing this story of a rather one-dimensional Wicked Witch, despised by everyone who's not under her control, who's ugly, and people celebrate when she dies. In one sense, it's true that Dorothy learns the lesson that ending the lives of your enemies solves your problems, and that we as viewers learn the same thing. Even if the filmmakers aren't trying to make a statement about evil, they are making one. And even if we don't really believe in wicked witches, our moral imaginations are shaped by stories like these. We see the world differently because we've watched movies like this. It's not just our imagination of what witches look like, but our imagination of what wickedness looks like and what the proper response to it is that's getting shaped here. I want to clarify that I'm not saying that The Wizard of Oz is bad moral training and kids shouldn't watch it. It's great. I love it. Nor am I saying that we should always be critical and analyzing everything rather than just enjoying it. It's a good thing to be transported sometimes. The quality of a movie or the worthwhileness of watching a movie is not simply measured by how correct its moral arguments are. But we should take responsibility for how we perceive the world around us, not just how we act within it. And we should be intentional about the messages we convey about the world, about good guys and bad guys, about right and wrong, in the art we make, the articles we share on social media, and the stories we tell. Given that our expectations, associations, judgments, fears, and prejudices are formed by artistic media as much as other sources, we should be aware of what we're taking in and how it might be affecting us. This means paying attention to the moral arguments we encounter in the arts and also critically reflecting on how our own moral imaginations have been formed. I also want to clarify that a more morally sophisticated account of evil is not the same as defending villains. The Wicked Witch of the West, remember, was going to kill the Scarecrow, Tin Man, Lion, and Toto, and make Dorothy watch. Watch it again. That's in the movie. Even if she may have had a legitimate claim to the ruby slippers, and even if the book and musical Wicked tell a different story, she does villainous things in the movie. Maybe melting her was the right response. Maybe something else would have been better. But we should make moral judgments about this character. All this is to say the goal is not to simply deconstruct how our moral imaginations have been formed, but also to think about how they should be formed. How should we think about good and evil in the world? How should we perceive the world we live in if villains play a special role in our moral formation, but there are many different ways one can write or depict a villain. One way that people talk about this is mapping different villains in terms of how sympathetic they are. So for an example of a generally unsympathetic villain, we can look to Cruella de Vil from the 1961 movie 101 Dalmatians. Cruella is iconic. Like the Wicked Witch, she's on the AFI's list of top 50 villains in American film history, and how could she not be darling? Every single piece of characterization Cruella is given tells us that she's bad news. Her name is just the words cruel and devil that have been tweaked to make them sound haughtier and more judgmental. The first thing we hear about her is the character Perdita saying, "It's her, it's that devil woman." The character Roger then sings an entire song about how evil she is. Everything she says and does in her opening scene is despicable. She also, maybe more than any other Disney villain, has the aesthetic down. I mean, come on. This is her car. This is her phone. We're not given any details about how she became the kind of person she is, at least not in this movie. And we're not encouraged to see her as a complex person with hopes and dreams. She is a caricature of a villain. Why did Disney portray her in such an unsympathetic way? The easy answer is that movies are short. They're usually between 90 and 120 minutes. The original 101 Dalmatians is only 79 minutes. So they need to orient you to the story world very quickly. In order to tell this one story about this one conflict, we want to get right to it and not waste time getting to know all of the characters organically. The beginnings of movies, generally, there are exceptions, are designed to give you the maximum amount of information and orientation in the minimum amount of time. Because she's depicted in such a clearly evil way, the movie makes a moral argument. Don't be like her. Don't be rude to maids. Don't abuse animals. Don't prioritize your own wardrobe over the well-being of others. She's a one-dimensional, unsympathetic villain, and I think to great effect. If, on the other hand, a character is a sympathetic villain, they generally do the wrong thing, but audiences can nonetheless relate to them. We see in them something that resonates with us, whether it's the motivations for their actions or the emotional responses they have. The word sympathy comes from the Greek word sympatheia, meaning feeling with. When you sympathize with someone, you don't necessarily think they're right, but you feel with them. You don't just have an explanation of why they are the way they are. You recognize their humanity, the same capacity to hope, fear, and love that you have. So when a villain is sympathetic, the viewer, at least in part, wants them to find peace and happiness, just not in the way they're currently pursuing them. A good recent example is Eric Killmonger Stevens from 2018's Black Panther. In the film, we see the traumatic past that led Killmonger to become the man he is. We recognize the legitimacy of his grievances against the people of Wakanda, and we feel a sense of grief when he ultimately dies. If it's fair to call Killmonger a villain, and I think it is, he's certainly a sympathetic villain. More than most villains, even in the Marvel Universe, he illustrates St. Thomas Aquinas' suggestion that a person can want good things, but go about pursuing them in a way that brings about unnecessary pain for themselves and others, or in a way that crosses moral boundaries that should not be crossed. In contrast to several other supervillains, whose stated goals are often just pretenses for a massive conflict, or who seem to pursue power for its own sake, Killmonger has a vision for a better world that most of us probably agree might be a better world, even if we rightfully deplore the actions he takes to get there, or doubt that his plan would actually lead to the world he longs for. Sympathetic villains sometimes do terrible, inexcusable actions. Sympathizing does not mean refraining from moral judgments. This is a really important distinction. When I'm making a moral judgment about an action, it's a judgment about what I believe a person should or should not do. When I'm sympathizing with a person making an action, that's more a matter of what I could see myself doing. A sympathetic villain isn't doing less bad actions than an unsympathetic villain, but we can recognize in their actions the possibility that if we were in their situation, if we had been through what they had been through, we might be tempted to act in similar ways. Both moral judgment and sympathy involve putting yourself to some extent in the other person's shoes, but one is what you think you should do, and what is what you think you could do or would do. Some have argued that American cinema is seeing an increase in sympathetic villains in recent years. I'm not sure if this is true of movies, but it does seem to be true of TV shows, where showrunners are not always under the same time constraints. A question we discuss in the class, and I would be interested to hear your thoughts as well, is if these arguments are correct and we're seeing an increase in sympathetic villains, is this trend a good thing? Do sympathetic villains cloud the moral picture and make it harder for us to take decisive collective action for the good? Or do they make it more likely for us to see others in more humanized ways? Should all villains be sympathetic? This is a complex question. I don't necessarily have a straightforward answer, but one insightful suggestion comes from the novelist Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie. In a popular lecture titled The Danger of a Single Story, Adichie talks about what it was like moving from Nigeria to the United States. Growing up, she had read many stories about American children and had a multifaceted understanding of what life was like in the US before visiting it. But while she had heard many stories about Americans to give her concepts for understanding the Americans she encountered, some of the people she met only had a limited repertoire of stories and concepts about Africans. She says, quote, "Years later, I thought about this when I left Nigeria to go to university in the United States. I was 19. My American roommate was shocked by me. She asked where I had learned to speak English so well, and was confused when I said that Nigeria happened to have English as its official language. She asked if she could listen to what she called my tribal music, and was consequently very disappointed when I produced my tape of Mariah Carey. She assumed that I did not know how to use a stove. My roommate had a single story of Africa, a single story of catastrophe. In this single story, there was no possibility of Africans being similar to her in any way, no possibility of feelings more complex than pity, no possibility of connection as human equals." Adichie goes on to say, quote, "After I had spent some years in the US and as an African, I began to understand my roommate's response to me. If I had not grown up in Nigeria and all I knew about Africa were from popular images, I too would think that Africa was a place of beautiful landscapes, beautiful animals, and incomprehensible people, fighting senseless wars, dying of poverty and AIDS, unable to speak for themselves, and waiting to be saved by a kind white foreigner. End quote. This is what Adichie calls the danger of a single story. In the terms I've been using, it's having a too narrow set of concepts that can lead us to mischaracterize and stereotype without us realizing that there's more going on than we recognize. Following Adichie's logic, there's nothing inherently wrong with having a one-dimensional, unsympathetic villain like Cruella de Vil, as long as that's not our only kind of story. Likewise, there's nothing inherently wrong with having a complex, sympathetic villain like Killmonger, as long as it's not our only kind of story. There are clear dangers to a steady diet of stories in which criminals are simply bad people, incapable of compassion and undeserving of it. There are also dangers to a steady diet of stories where characters who hurt others are simply misunderstood, or of abusive boyfriends who can be reformed if they're just loved enough. For responsible filmmaking and responsible film watching, we have to be on guard against the lure of a single story, and making and enjoying a diverse range of media is an important part of that. Maybe, just maybe, if Spielberg had also made a movie about a lovable great white shark teaching a child the value of friendship, that would have counterbalanced the one-sided influence of Jaws. It's worth imagining. Thank you.
Thank you, Russell. We do have a few questions. One of the first ones I want to ask is from Priya, who would be interested in your reflections regarding the colors, for example, green associated with evil. Like, is it random that the Wicked Witch of the West was green with its associations with like poison? Or do you think that, say, green was also portrayed positively, like in the Emerald City? What do you think about the colors we see when we see villains?
That's great, and I wish I knew more about this. I mean, there's been a lot written about color characterization in villains, in particular with regard to Disney villain Green. I think the poison connection is a good one. I also think that the stark contrast is a good one. We tend to our eyes tend to see people who are wearing colors that complement each other very well in positive lights, whereas colors that really jump out from each other, they seem larger than life. And so black, which of course has negative connotations, and this bright lime green, for instance, or this bright green, really they sort of pop in a particular way, and it's so I think. I think it's a good question, and it's also interesting to see how this takes on a life of its own independently of the extra film category. So there may be some like deep human psychology about why green and red and black, for instance, make good villain colors and why yellow not as much. But even if there isn't a deep psychology reason that becomes baked into the genre, that it becomes a sort of shorthand of, oh, this is a villain. How can you tell? Well, look at them. And we see this with other characterizations. My students look at the Red Skull, for instance, the bad guy of the Captain America movie, as just like clearly in taking on being in that uncanny valley of like human enough but not human quite, in such a way that unsettles us, and also taking on his costuming is styled using the same sort of idea that echoes Nazi uniforms, for instance. And so the language, the aesthetic language to characterize villains is a mixture of things like pre-existing cultural stereotypes, often very negative ones, sort of psychological shortcuts, and then cinematic shortcuts that work for us based on what we've already experienced. But yeah, the question about green is a really good one.
And another question, do you think that the rise in sympathetic villains correlates to the appreciable way to the public of favoring political figures who break with prevailing trends of moral propriety?
This is a good question. I can name names. I think so. I mean, I think um, a lot of villains have a sort of, I'm doing the right thing. I'm just willing to go further than anyone else to do it and to get what is necessary. There's a kind of dirty hands ethics that can make for an interesting sympathetic villain. And we may be more inclined to make villains like that and to sympathize with villains like that when there is a kind of prevailing sense that the moral norms within our society are holding us back from taking the kind of utilitarian actions that lead to the best results. I think it would be interesting. I make a distinction between sympathetic villains and anti-heroes. Whereas an anti-hero is someone who, in the universe of the film, or in the way the film is being conveyed to viewers, is someone that we should generally see as the hero, someone like a Deadpool, for instance, or a Han Solo, but who goes about what they do in a way that is not held up for emulation. That's what an anti-hero is, whereas a sympathetic villain is not usually the protagonist, not usually the good guy, but is actually depicted as a bad guy. So I would imagine there is a greater correlation between the rise of anti-heroes, which is to say people who are trying to do the good thing, and we sympathize with them in that we identify with them because they're usually the protagonist. I would imagine there's probably a greater connection to the rise of anti-heroes and to a greater sense of uh, political desperation that leads people to think that the laws of ordinary behavior are holding us back. Whether that's more in a totalitarian regime sensibility or more in a kind of environmental activism sensibility. I mean, we see it across the political spectrum in different ways.
We have two follow-up questions about anti-heroes that I'm going to ask together before moving to a different topic. We have a question about what you think about the anti-heroes in Unforgiven and Shawshank Redemption. Like, are anti-heroes to be admired or are they unredeemable? And then a similar question is, how do we deal with something like Breaking Bad, where the protagonist is in some ways on a heroic journey, but the journey is to become the worst villain in the plot?
Yeah. So I would characterize Walter White in Breaking Bad as a villain protagonist, which is to say he is the protagonist, he is the character, the main character whom the story follows, but his arc is not necessarily a positive arc like we typically associate with Joseph Campbell type heroes. Rather, it's a narrative of descent. I mean, we see something similar in the Godfather movies, for instance. Probably the first Godfather is the best example of a villain protagonist. And I think that's really interesting. And again, you can do that well in a television setting. I mean, Breaking Bad, of course, had better writers than almost every other show. But that sense of seeing how we can see in real time how a character is faced with choices and makes bad choices that sets them up to make worse choices. And so like the sort of Aristotelian character formation, we're sort of forced to follow that in something like a Breaking Bad. So I think of that as different from a sympathetic villain in a way. Although we do see those a lot in TV. I mean, I think of Daredevil, for instance, and actually several of the other Marvel TV shows. Um, in terms of Shawshank Redemption, I mean, I think I'm curious who you have in mind for sympathetic villains in that. I mean, I take the villain to be the warden, but part of what the movie is doing is showing that characters who are villainized and marginalized and othered by society because of their imprisonment and perhaps because of their crimes are actually capable of a greater humanity than those who operate by a sort of at least strict outward sense of morality that is even more ultimately corrupt, like the warden and some of the guards. So I think the drama of Shawshank Redemption. I talk about Unforgiven, but it's been 15 to 20 years since I've seen it. I need to rewatch it. Is one of external appearances versus internal integrity. And that drama plays out throughout the film in a way that where we see, I mean, ultimately the warden himself, it's his own, uh, he reaps the consequences of his own exploitation in a way that I think is makes for a good ending for that character.
We have a question from Hillary, asking in terms of the way that female villains, especially witches in this case, are portrayed, how do you see the relationship between portrayals of evil and portrayals of sexuality? She adds that some literary critics have talked about two types of witches, the ugly witches, like the Wicked Witch of the West, and
Second, can
hypersexualized or glamorous witches,
mhm.
as in Cruella. Do you agree with that characterization? And what do you think it means, or what do you think the valence is?
Yeah, this is great. So I think one, there's a good article called "Please Just Let Women Be Villains" that we read in the class. That part of what it's doing, I recommend it. I don't remember the name of the author off the top of my head. And the author is arguing is that movies like Cruella and Maleficent, and Wicked to some extent, also are trying to reinforce this idea that women are ultimately the pure moral guardians, and that they're not really villains, they're just made that way, and by society, which is a somewhat honorable lesson to impart. But as the author argues, this comes at the expense of flattening the moral agency of the female characters that are depicted. And so if you want to tell a rich and complicated picture of women, don't just picture them as misunderstood heroes. Picture them as people who have the full range of complexity, as of course is true in real life. The part about sexuality is really interesting because I think one of the attractions of our cultural code of witches is that they act in ways outside the boundaries of the norm. And acting outside the boundaries of the norm can have a positive valence or a negative valence. I mean, sort of like order and disorder. There are in movies, oftentimes there are order villains who are trying to impose an order on the universe in a constrictive way, trying to achieve a kind of purity and perfection and stability and permanence, and such that the rebels, the rebellious characters, are the heroes. And then there are villains who are trying to dismantle in an order that is worth preserving. Think of Mulan, for instance, trying to tear down the empire. And so the characters are trying to, or Batman is always trying to preserve a sort of order, usually. And so witches can be, when the order that is existence is portrayed as good, then witches who are sort of rebel characters are threats to the existing social order. And we see this in The Wizard of Oz. Whereas when the order in play is portrayed as evil, then as we see in Wicked, for instance, then the rebellious witch character is depicted as good. And what's interesting is this same sort of social order rebellion outside the norms plays out in the way that our society thinks about sexuality as well, which is to say that the witch occupies a space outside the cultural codes that we restrain oneself and others around, surrounding sexuality. This is not news to anyone. And so witches can be, by sexualizing them, both in movies where they're the good guys and the bad guys, we can put them a little bit more in the camp of someone who's not necessarily following the rules that has a society. There's a sort of sexy rebelliousness that has exists within a sort of tropic imagination that filmmakers can selectively pick up to shortcut our viewers' understanding in a particular way. Madison, I believe you're muted.
We have a question on whether you think villains tend to serve more for people as permission, so permission giving for bad behavior, or if they serve more as cautionary tales of what not to be.
Interesting. So I think this is a good question. I think they are serve more as cautionary tales, but I think there is, so remember one of the points I gave is normalization, which is to say that if we see a lot of characters doing something, we assume that that is a thing, a live option that is up to be done. So the more we see somebody doing something, even if they're portrayed as doing it with a negative valence, where they're like the movie is clearly passing judgment on this character for doing this immoral action, simply seeing it, now it's on our list of things. It moves from our list of things that nobody does to things that people do. And so, I mean, like underage drinking, for example, is an idea of something that has become very normalized. Even if there's a kind of um, the DARE program, as you may be aware of, which told people not to do drugs, was definitely trying to stigmatize drug use. But part of the ironic effects of the DARE program and why people argued it was ultimately iatrogenic, like it was ultimately counterproductive, is what it was doing is reinforcing the idea that, hey, everybody does drugs. And so I think in villainous performances, I think they're meant to be cautionary tales where we see, oh, these characters are doing something they shouldn't do, but this may be part of the point you're getting at, especially, like exploitative business leaders in villain movies, for instance. Now we expect that that's what people in positions of power are going to do because we have seen characters in positions of power, and people who want to make use of that imaginary shortcut can draw on that to where now Gordon Gekko is not a cautionary tale, in from Wall Street, but now just what we think business leaders are. So I think there is a sense in which villains can become sort of self-fulfilling prophecy in through this process of normalization.
We have a question about the attractiveness of villains, that attractiveness sometimes seems to be leveraged as a tool to cloak rebels or villains in sympathy, that in real life mugshots don't always go viral when they're ugly, but might go viral when they're hot.
Sure.
What does it mean for an attractive villain to exist on the screen or in a presentation?
Oh, this is great. Yeah, I think it. I mean, I think an attractive villain, what I assume is that there is the connotation is temptation. And so an attractive villain, because of the way we treat attractive people in our society, they're allowed to get away with more. And the sort of there's a sort of power that we assume attractive people have over other people. And so I think the some of those imaginative shortcuts for attractive villains, it can be a way of making the villain seem even more powerful, but through a social power rather than through physical power, for instance. And Gone Girl. I'll just throw that in there. As a movie, if you haven't seen it, forget that I said anything. But uh, I think in terms of in a lot of Disney movies historically they try and make, and a lot of James Bond movies of course, they try and make the villain ugly because it fulfills that sort of short monkey brain shortcut of this person is other, this person is different, this person is therefore bad. It's easier for us to pick them out and be like they're the one who's unlike us in a way that has really unfortunate negative connotations for people's real lives. Whereas when it comes to attractive villains, I think there is a sort of it puts them in a different light, to where especially because the significant majority of people who are in Hollywood movies are also in the top 10% of most attractive people. So it's not entirely accidental that there are attractive movie villains, because Hollywood keeps wanting to, and not just Hollywood, but other studios, keep wanting to cast attractive people. But I think as you're getting at, I mean, there's a little bit more about what that conveys about a character, and can be part of that implicit visual language through which we understand what a character is like and what a character can do.
We are getting close to our time, so this will be our last question. Thank you so much, Dr. Johnson. The question is about the shorthand of the lesson. So if someone is confronted with someone who's making an argument they find difficult or repulsive, such as a violent argument to serve what appear to be good ends, is there a way you might give a shorthand version of this lesson to try to convince them in, say, 5 minutes that they need to rethink how they're pursuing their aims?
This is a big question, and I probably won't be able to get to all of it. But I mean, I think part of what I'm hearing in the question is a reference again to this Thomas Aquinas idea that Thomas Aquinas' moral psychology. Everything that we want is actually, at its deepest level, a good thing to want. There is a good concern at the root of all things, I mean, this is how, for instance, in Catholic moral psychology, people talk about the seven deadly sins. Sleep is a good thing, sex is a good thing, food is a good thing, but where they become sinful when we are pursuing them in a way that is disordered, destructive toward ourselves and others, etc. And so I think one of the lessons from this is if you take that moral psychology, that people are ultimately wanting a good thing, but wanting it in a way that brings about unnecessary harms, or wanting it in a way that leads to others suffering or their own suffering, or wanting it in a way that breaches a clear moral boundary that should not be breached, then the mode of confrontation should be a way of leading them to the same good end that they wanted, that doesn't make those same sacrifices or make those same compromises. I mean, Martin Buber, the great Jewish philosopher, talks about whenever you see somebody sculpting an idol, don't try and just destroy the idol. Try and think about what aspects of God they were actually trying to capture and lead them to that instead. And I think we can think analogously with regard to people's moral concerns. Instead of saying like, let's say someone is advocating for arming of teachers in schools because they think this is going to bring about greater security for their children. Any effort to persuade them not to go forward with that plan should begin with a recognition of you're right to care about our kids' security. I just think this way of going about doing it is actually going to endanger more lives rather than save more lives. And then you're arguing simultaneously with and against a person who is holding a belief that, again, we can make moral judgments, I think is a very dangerous belief. So that kind of with and againstness, helping them get to the end that they're trying to get to, but via a different route that's less harmful, destructive, wicked, etc. I think that's often a very useful and moral approach.
Thank you so much, Dr. Johnson. Thank you for your presentation, and thank you to everyone who was able to attend today. Just as a reminder, a recording of the lecture has been made, and it will be sent out early next week to all event registrants, so you can share it with your friends, make sure that they get to see what we were able to do this evening. Thank you also to the Alumni Club of San Diego, and especially to Bari Berman for all of her diligent work in issuing invitations, promoting the lecture, and providing us with this opportunity and invitation to share with you today. We do appreciate your attendance, and we hope to see you at another event soon. Please do have a lovely evening and take care.